The morning sun filtered through the wide glass windows of the coastal cafe, casting long amber streaks across the polished wooden floors. The soft clinking of cups and the low hum of conversation filled the space with a warm, rhythmic stillness that belonged only to slow weekday mornings. A soft breeze from the open door stirred the linen curtains ever so slightly, carrying the scent of sea salt and roasted coffee beans. At a corner table, nestled near a tall stack of books on a window ledge, sat a young woman who didn't seem to belong to the noise or the movement around her. She looked like she had wandered in from a quieter world, a place where details mattered and words lived longer than people. Her name was Avery James, 26 years old, dressed in a simple cream-colored cotton dress that reached below her knees and sandals that looked comfortable but well-worn. Her light brown hair was pulled back into a soft knot, with wisps framing her delicate face. She had the kind of quiet beauty that didn't draw attention immediately but lingered once you noticed it. Like a painting you passed by and later found yourself thinking about. There was nothing about her outfit that screamed for attention, no bright colors or heavy accessories, but there was something in the way she sat, spine straight, hands gentle, that suggested she came from a world of inner structure, of order and meaning. Avery had a small, weathered notebook open in front of her, along with a portable set of watercolors and a mechanical pencil with the grip slightly frayed from use. Next to it sat a ceramic cup of green tea, the steam rising like silk ribbons into the air. She was sketching something, or someone, though her hand moved slowly as if she was listening as much as drawing. Occasionally she glanced up at the elderly couple sitting 2 tables down, the wife dabbing her lips with a napkin, the husband carefully stirring sugar into his coffee. Their stillness, their comfort with each other, fascinated Avery more than anything she might find on her phone. She sketched quietly without any intention of sharing the drawing. It was just a study, a meditation, something private. This was her habit, to find moments of quiet in the ordinary and preserve them like pressed flowers in a book. Most people in the cafe barely registered her presence. She was too soft, too silent, too unremarkable, at least to those who measured worth by loudness or labels. But that never bothered her. In fact, she preferred it. Avery wasn't there to be seen. She wasn't a regular, and yet she didn't seem out of place. She had stopped here on a whim, on her way home from delivering a bouquet of hand-tied garden roses to an elderly client who had lost her cat. She liked to walk rather than drive, liked to let her day unfold instead of dictate it. The cafe, with its mismatched chairs and bookshelves filled with forgotten paperbacks, felt like a small reward for her effort. She sat in the same way she painted, patiently, attentively, almost reverently. Her eyes, a soft hazel touched with green, held the look of someone who had learned how to see not just the surface of things, but the delicate lines beneath, the stories that ran under the skin of the world. And yet, beneath all that softness was a quiet resolve. She had not always been invisible. There was a time, not so long ago, when her name was whispered in university art departments, when her final year gallery show had made local headlines for the haunting depth of her illustration series. But she had stepped away from that life after something broke. Something personal, something painful. Now she earned her living arranging flowers for a small shop in town and taking quiet commissions from those who still remembered her work. She had learned to live modestly, simply, but not without joy. That morning she felt peaceful, centered. Her tea was hot, the light was good, and the moment of that rare and fleeting thing felt perfect. And then, as the front door of the cafe opened again, and a sudden gust of perfume and authority blew in with the sharp click of expensive heels, everything in that moment began to shift, like the wind before a storm. The rhythm of the cafe, once so calm and composed, faltered the moment the front door swung open with a kind of sharp finality. In stepped a woman who did not enter the way most people did, quietly, modestly, respectfully, but rather as though the room itself had been waiting for her, like the stage lights should flick on just for her presence. Her name was Linda Draper, though few in town ever called her that. To most, she was simply Mrs. Draper or the Draper Woman, someone who made herself known wherever she went, whether anyone wanted her to or not. She was in her mid-50s, tall and statuesque, in the way that only money and an obsessive fear of irrelevance could sculpt someone to be. Her platinum blonde bob was precision cut and lacquered into place, her lips lined into a permanent expression of dismissal. Wrapped in a cashmere shawl that must have cost more than a month's rent for most, She moved with a practiced elegance that didn't quite mask the edge of entitlement in her stride. She paused just inside the doorway, her designer sunglasses still on despite the filtered sunlight, surveying the room like a queen assessing her court. Her heels, sharp, glossy, impossibly high, clicked authoritatively on the floor as she took several deliberate steps toward the center of the cafe. The barista greeted her with forced cheer, a tight smile stretched across her face as she asked if Mrs. Draper would like her usual table. Linda's gaze snapped toward the corner window, the exact table where Avery sat, still quietly sketching. For a moment, Linda simply stared, as if the sight of someone else occupying her habitual spot was not just an inconvenience, but a personal insult, an affront to the natural order of things. She didn't recognize Avery, of course. Why would she? People like Linda didn't see girls in cotton dresses and handmade sandals. They saw placeholders, obstacles, service staff. Nothing about Avery's quiet posture or her lack of branded accessories registered as worth acknowledging. "Excuse me," Linda said, not to Avery directly, but loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, her voice carrying that unmistakable tone of someone who has never in her life had to repeat herself. "I believe you're in my seat." Avery looked up, blinking slowly, the tip of her pencil suspended in midair. There was no confusion on her face, only polite curiosity, the kind reserved for someone who had not yet decided whether the person speaking was joking or not. "I'm sorry," she asked, softly but clearly, her voice calm. Linda took a step closer, her brows raised as if surprised that Avery had the audacity not to immediately vacate. "That table," she said, gesturing with her manicured hand, her thick diamond bracelet catching the light dramatically. "It's mine. I sit there every morning. Surely the staff must have forgotten to reserve it. I'll forgive them. It's been a long week." She gave a sharp, pointed glance to the nearest server, who stood frozen, unsure of how to intervene. "But I'd like you to move now." Avery sat up straighter, setting her pencil gently on the table. "I didn't see any sign," she said quietly. "The table was open when I came in, so I sat down. I'm not trying to inconvenience anyone." Linda scoffed. Not laughed, but truly scoffed. A short, sharp burst of breath that carried more contempt than a paragraph of insults. "That table doesn't need a sign. Everyone knows it's mine. It's always been mine. People have enough sense not to sit there." "I'm not from here," Avery replied, still composed, though a faint line had appeared between her brows. "I wasn't aware of the tradition." Linda crossed her arms, the folds of her shawl shifting like velvet armor. "Well, now you are. So kindly stand up and move to one of the smaller tables by the kitchen. Those are more appropriate." The cafe had quieted significantly. Conversations faltered. Spoons rested mid-stir. A few heads turned, subtly, eyes flicking between the two women. Avery could feel the attention, but she didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice or plead or apologize for her presence. She simply said, "I'd like to finish my tea if that's all right." That was when something in Linda snapped. The tight control she held over her image, the carefully curated tone of superiority, all gave way to a flash of rage that had been waiting beneath the surface like a crack beneath ice. She took 2 quick steps forward, leaned down, and in a sudden movement so swift it startled everyone in its radius, she slapped Avery across the face. The sound was small but sharp. Skin against skin, a flat crack that cut through the silence like a dropped plate. Avery's head turned slightly with the force, but she didn't cry out. She didn't fall back or even gasp. Her hand moved reflexively to her cheek where a faint pink bloom had begun to rise. Her eyes, wide for only a heartbeat, narrowed slightly as she turned back to look at Linda, whose chest now rose and fell rapidly, whether from the exertion or the adrenaline or the sheer satisfaction of having put someone in their place. For a moment, no one moved. The cafe seemed suspended in time. No clattering cups, no whispers, no music. Only the sound of Linda's breathing and Avery's slow, even inhale. "I'm sorry," Linda said, not with remorse but with sarcasm, eyes glittering with a cruel amusement. "But I don't respond well to disrespect." Avery did not respond immediately. Her hand dropped from her cheek. She blinked once, slowly. Her gaze drifted to the barista, who looked stricken. and then to the couple she had been sketching earlier. The older man now sitting rigidly, his mouth set in a tight line, the woman gripping her spoon as if it anchored her to something solid. Avery turned back to Linda and spoke with a voice so steady it startled even herself. "You just hit someone for sitting at a table." "It's my table," Linda snapped, as if the sentence should carry legal weight, as if the world should naturally align to her preferences. "And that," Avery said, still not raising her voice, "tells me everything I need to know about you." Linda flinched, not at the words, but at the way they were said. Quiet, precise, without venom. As if she wasn't worth yelling at. As if she wasn't important enough to hate. And somehow, that stung more than any retaliation might have. She straightened her shoulders, smoothed her shawl, and turned as if to walk away. But the air in the cafe had shifted. The room no longer felt like hers. And everyone was still watching. Only now, they weren't waiting to see what she would do next. They were watching Avery, and Avery, who had come in simply for a quiet moment of tea and light, now sat still, hand resting lightly on the table's edge, her face calm but unreadable, as the first ripples of something larger, something irreversible, began to move through the room. The silence that followed lingered with an almost physical weight, as if every breath in the cafe had been momentarily suspended, every cup halfway to a lip now frozen, every thought halted midstream. No one moved. It was that peculiar kind of stillness that arrives not with awe or admiration, but with shock, confusion, and the awkward collective awareness that something entirely inappropriate has just taken place. Yet no one knows exactly what to do about it. The sound of the slap still seemed to echo faintly in the space between Avery and Linda, though in truth the noise had already passed. What remained was its memory, the sting of it, not only on Avery's cheek but in the eyes of those who had witnessed it. Avery remained seated, her spine no longer leaning in relaxation but rigid with quiet strength, her hands flat on the table. Her face was tilted slightly, her profile outlined against the morning light still pouring in through the windows. And though the flush of the slap remained, her composure hadn't cracked. She looked like a sculpture in the moment between impact and rebirth. Neither passive nor aggressive, but somewhere ancient and still. Linda, however, had begun to shift. She was breathing faster now, though she tried to mask it by adjusting her oversized bag and smoothing down her shawl with trembling fingers. It was that familiar pattern. Say something outrageous, do something worse, then expect the world to bend back into shape around you through force of habit. She looked around now, as if seeking someone, anyone, to back her up, to validate her reaction, to restore the invisible social contract that always seemed to protect her from consequences. But the room no longer belonged to her. The eyes she met weren't deferential. They weren't afraid either. They were cautious, disapproving, curious, and worst of all, they were awake. The barista behind the counter appeared frozen in some half-motion, a bottle of syrup dangling from one hand, while her other gripped the espresso machine like it might offer balance. She looked like she wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't form, and so she remained still, uncertain whether she should apologize, intervene, or vanish entirely. A few younger patrons had quietly pulled out their phones, not to record, but in a reflexive act of distraction, as though the weight of witnessing something real and uncomfortable was too much to bear head-on. Avery finally moved. Not dramatically, not with any sudden gestures, but with the gentle grace of someone who had learned long ago that the more fragile your dignity feels, the more carefully you must carry it. She reached for her cup of tea and took a slow sip, her lips barely parting, her hand steady. The small act of normalcy was both jarring and grounding, a silent reminder that even after humiliation the world keeps turning, and so must you. She placed the cup back down, then lifted her gaze and locked eyes with Linda. What passed between them in that moment wasn't anger or confrontation. It was something quieter, deeper, and far more dangerous to someone like Linda. Recognition. Not of superiority, not even of guilt, but of irrelevance. Avery saw through her, not past her, and in doing so, stripped her power away. "I'm not leaving," Avery said calmly, her voice low but clear, as though she were stating a weather condition, not declaring a line in the sand. "And I'm not going to argue with you, but I think you should sit somewhere else." It wasn't a suggestion, though it didn't sound like a command either. It was just the truth, spoken plainly and without decoration. The kind of truth that unsettles those who depend on lies dressed as courtesy. Linda blinked several times, her face twitching with conflicting emotions. Pride, confusion, outrage, and a sudden irrational fear that she was losing control. "This is harassment," she said loudly, turning to the cafe staff now, her voice rising in pitch. "This girl is disturbing the peace. I have been a loyal customer here for years. I donate to the local theater. I sponsor the garden club. I know the mayor. Are you all just going to sit there while she disrespects me?" Still, no one answered. The words fell into the quiet like small stones into deep water. Heard, but quickly swallowed. The barista exchanged a look with the manager who had just emerged from the back. A man in his late 40s with kind eyes and a tired posture that suggested he'd been doing this job long enough to have seen nearly everything, except perhaps this. He stepped forward slowly, folding a towel over his arm like a mediator approaching a battlefield. "Mrs. Draper," he said, gently but firmly, "I think maybe you should take another table for today. Let's just all cool down, okay?" Linda turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "You're taking her side? She hit me with her attitude the moment I walked in. You all saw it. Sitting there like she owns the place. Look at her!" She pointed at Avery like she were pointing at something that had no business existing. "She's not even dressed properly. This is a respectable place, not a free clinic." Avery felt a heat rising in her chest then, not from shame, but from something older, deeper, something shaped like memory and injustice braided together. She took a breath, and for the first time, she stood. The chair scraped softly against the floor, the sound somehow louder than Linda's voice had been. Avery didn't raise her hands or step forward. She simply stood still, letting her presence speak. "You're not angry because of the table," she said, quietly, but everyone heard. "You're angry because I didn't move when you told me to. That's what this is really about." A murmur of something passed through the room. Not a sound exactly, but a shift in temperature, a collective acknowledgement. Linda stepped back half an inch, her shoulders tightening, her jaw clenched. Her mouth opened, but she couldn't find the words she needed. Not the right ones. Not the ones that would return things to how they were 10 minutes ago. Avery looked to the manager. "I'd like to sit down and finish my tea," she said gently. "I'll be quiet. I'll leave when I'm done." The man nodded once, slowly. "Of course," he said. "Take your time." Avery sat back down, carefully adjusting her chair, smoothing the edge of her notebook with the same hand that had just been struck. She picked up her pencil again and returned to her drawing, as if the moment had passed, even if no one in the room would ever forget it. Linda stood in place, blinking rapidly, her face pale with the creeping realization that she had not just lost an argument, but lost control of the space, of the perception of others, and most terrifying of all, of her image. In her world where status was everything and appearance was law, she had just suffered the greatest defeat imaginable. She had been ignored. Not insulted, not confronted, ignored. And somehow, that silence roared louder than anything she had ever heard. Time in the cafe did not resume so much as it shifted, changed shape, as if the air itself had thickened. Conversations restarted in hushed tones. Spoons tapped the rims of mugs a little more cautiously, and chairs scraped against the floor with exaggerated care. But nothing returned to how it was before. Something had cracked open, something invisible but deeply felt. Avery remained at her table, the page of her sketchbook still resting beneath her hands, though the image she had been working on now seemed distant, as though it belonged to another life, another version of the morning that would no longer be completed. Her fingers moved almost absently over the page, not drawing now, but hovering, tracing the ghost of what she had once intended to create. She could feel the flush still lingering on her cheek, warm and dull like the aftermath of sunburn, not painful so much as persistent. Her face remained composed, but internally something had begun to stir. Not rage or bitterness, but a deep and stubborn ache. The kind born from years of swallowing small injustices until one, out of nowhere, forces them all to rise to the surface. Linda had relocated, but not quietly. After a pointed silence, she had stormed off to a table near the entrance, where she now sat stiffly with her arms crossed, sunglasses back in place despite the filtered light. She stared out the window with the intensity of someone pretending to be unaffected. pretending so hard that it became its own form of performance. Her lips pressed into a tight, immovable line, though her fingers tapped restlessly against the table, betraying her need for the world to confirm her narrative, that she had been wronged, not resisted. Occasionally she glanced toward Avery, hoping perhaps to catch her eye, to find a flicker of fear or remorse that could justify her indignation. But Avery never looked back. What Linda could not see, what no one in the room could see, was the quiet conversation Avery was having with herself. The voice in her mind wasn't loud, but it was persistent, familiar in its rhythm. You should have walked away. You should have avoided the table. You should have apologized, even if it wasn't your fault. You're not built for this. That voice had been with her since childhood, shaped by classrooms where teachers praised the louder students, by friendships that ended when she stopped being easy to control, by relationships where compromise always meant shrinking. She knew it wasn't true. Not anymore. But it still lived in her like muscle memory. But now, in this still space, she let herself acknowledge the strange and steady pulse in her chest, the grounded sense that, for once, she had not shrunk. She had not apologized for simply existing. And that, more than anything, felt dangerous. Because once you stand your ground, you learn how much of your life has been spent backing away. She glanced down at her cup, nearly empty now, the tea cooled and forgotten. Her hand reached for it, paused, and then dropped to her lap. She wasn't thirsty. She was still, but not settled. Something inside her had shifted. Not a decision, not yet, but the beginning of one. A quiet certainty that things could no longer return to how they were. Not here, not in this space where she had been made visible through someone else's attempt to erase her. The door opened again with the soft chime of the bell, and a tall, silver-haired man stepped inside. He was dressed simply in a light sweater and worn jeans, his posture unhurried. He paused just inside, looking around the cafe with the easy familiarity of someone who had been here before, many times, and who would likely be here again. His eyes found Avery, and then, subtly, they found Linda. For a moment he watched both of them, his gaze thoughtful but unreadable. Then, with a small nod to no one in particular, he walked slowly toward the bar and ordered a black coffee. Avery recognized him, but not personally. He was one of those figures you saw in small towns, the kind of man who sat on library boards and showed up at local galleries with quiet curiosity. His name escaped her, but his presence was calming. Like a painting in the background you didn't notice until you needed to. After he received his drink, he didn't sit, but instead approached her table with a kind of gentle gravity. "Miss," he said, his voice low and steady, "I don't mean to intrude, but I saw what happened earlier. I just wanted to say, some of us noticed. Not everyone looks away." Avery looked up, startled not by his presence, but by the kindness in his tone. "Thank you," she said simply, because she didn't know what else to say. He nodded once, then leaned in a little, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "My wife passed last winter. She used to sit by that window every Tuesday, right where you are now. It was her favorite spot. She said the light there made her feel young." He smiled faintly. "So when I saw what happened, I thought, maybe that's why you ended up there today. Maybe it's not just a table." And with that, he walked away, settling into a chair near the bookshelf where he sipped his coffee and pulled out a folded newspaper. Avery sat still for a long moment, letting his words settle in, letting the warmth of them reach the places inside her that had gone cold. It wasn't just a table. And this wasn't just another morning. She had come in seeking quiet, but life had handed her something far less gentle, far more necessary. A confrontation not only with someone else's cruelty, but with her own silence. And now she could no longer pretend she hadn't heard herself speak. The stillness that had settled into the cafe began to stretch, like a thread pulled too tightly on the verge of snapping. Though everything appeared calm on the surface, cups quietly clinking, the espresso machine humming back to life, a spoon stirring sugar with slow rhythm, there was an invisible tension beneath it all, subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't just the aftermath of the confrontation, it was what hadn't been said yet, what hung between the tables like thick air before a thunderstorm. Avery sat quietly at her corner, her fingers no longer touching her sketch pad, but folded in her lap, her posture collected yet alert, as though her body had learned to expect intrusion at any moment. There was no more pretending now. The morning had been reshaped. The people who had first glanced past her now looked in her direction with something closer to awareness. Some glanced with sympathy, some with discomfort, but they looked, and that in itself changed everything. Across the room, Linda remained at her new table, but her body language had changed from self-assuredness to tightly wound irritation. She had taken off her sunglasses, revealing eyes that scanned the room like a surveillance drone, searching for signs of loyalty, of control, of some remaining social gravity she might still command. But all she saw were people pretending not to notice her, and that, perhaps, was the greatest insult of all. She picked up her phone, scrolled rapidly, muttering under her breath, then made a call. Her voice, though not loud, was edged with venom. "Yes, it's me, at the cafe. No, she's still here. No one's done a thing. Yes, I want it handled. I don't care how. Just come." She hung up without a goodbye and sat back, exhaling through her teeth like steam escaping a cracked pipe. Avery didn't hear the conversation, but she didn't need to. She could feel the shift in the room, the way Linda's posture had changed from defensive to strategic, the way her eyes flicked back now not with rage but with calculation. There was a difference between someone who acts out of fury and someone who regains control. And what was coming would not be another outburst, it would be something worse. Measured. Planned? As if on cue, the door to the cafe opened again, and a sharply dressed woman stepped inside, her black heels tapping with precise rhythm, her crisp blazer immaculate, her expression professional and unreadable. She moved with intention, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Linda, who offered the faintest nod. The woman crossed the floor, not toward Linda, but toward the counter, where she quietly exchanged a few words with the barista and the manager. Whatever she said was soft enough not to carry, but firm enough to cause visible tension. The manager's brows furrowed. The barista paled. There was a short, hushed exchange, the kind that feels like a whisper yelled into the silence. And then the woman turned and made her way toward Avery. Her voice when she spoke was low and polite, but distant, like someone delivering a legal notice rather than initiating a conversation. "Excuse me, miss," she said. "Would you mind stepping outside with me for a moment? We've had a complaint. I'd like to discuss it in private." Avery looked at her, then past her, then briefly at Linda, who sat watching with the cold smile of someone who believes their position has been reinstated. The power had shifted again, and this time it had come in the form of politeness dressed as procedure, of control masked as professionalism. Avery's voice remained calm. "What kind of complaint?" "I'm not at liberty to say," the woman replied smoothly, "but we'd appreciate your cooperation. We don't want to escalate things." Avery's eyes met hers. "I think that's already happened." The woman's expression didn't change. "It will only take a moment, I assure you." The room seemed to exhale around them. Chairs creaked slightly as people adjusted their positions. No one daring to interfere, but all listening. Avery stood, but not in defeat. She stood with the slow, deliberate movements of someone reclaiming control over her own limbs, her own choices. "Fine," she said, "but I won't be silent out there just to make someone in here comfortable." The woman didn't respond. She simply led the way, heels tapping like punctuation marks in a sentence no one wanted to read. Avery followed, out the door, onto the narrow street that still smelled faintly of sea breeze and coffee grounds. Outside, the woman turned, dropped the pleasant tone, and became direct. "Mrs. Draper is a long-standing figure in this community. Her reputation is not something to be questioned lightly." Avery folded her arms. "Her actions just slapped me in front of a dozen people. I don't need to question her reputation. I watched it collapse." The woman blinked, unused to confrontation. "This town runs on reputation," she said, a little too sharply now. "You don't want to put yourself on the wrong side of it." Avery took a breath. "Do you hear yourself? I stood my ground after being hit. I didn't scream. I didn't retaliate. I didn't cause a scene. But I'm still the problem?" The woman hesitated. "I'm just trying to de-escalate this situation." "No," Avery said firmly. "You're trying to keep things quiet. That's different." Her voice was calm but resonant, not loud but undeniably present. "You don't want justice. You want neatness." There was a long pause between them, during which the wind picked up, tugging lightly at the hem of Avery's dress. The woman seemed uncertain now, thrown off by Avery's refusal to yield. "If you return inside," she said finally, "I suggest you remain at a different table." Avery's gaze didn't waver. "I'll return to the one I chose." And then, without waiting for a response, she turned and walked back through the cafe doors. The eyes that met her return weren't wide with curiosity anymore. They were open with recognition. Someone offered her a quiet nod. Another, an older woman near the window, smiled faintly as if to say, "Thank you." Linda's posture stiffened, but she said nothing. She watched, silent now, and for the first time, uncertain. Avery crossed the cafe with her head high and sat back down at her table. Not just in the same chair, but in the same place in her own story, the one she had refused to surrender. The page in her sketchbook still waited. The tea had gone cold, but her resolve had not. Something in her had risen that would not be silenced, not anymore. And the whole room knew it. The moment Avery sat back down, something irreversible settled into the air, like the final note of a melody that leaves the room still and changed. She didn't fidget or glance around for approval. She didn't need to. Her body, once tucked in with quiet intention, now occupied the space fully with a quiet poise that didn't demand attention, but made it impossible to look away. The sunlight that had warmed her page earlier now spilled across the table in sharper angles, casting long, deliberate shadows across the smooth wooden surface. Her sketch lay open, though her pencil remained untouched. She was no longer here to draw. She had become the drawing, the focus, the force, the center of something unfolding far beyond her original purpose. Linda, across the room, had shifted from gloating to bristling, her fingers clenched around her purse strap like a lifeline. The woman she had called in, her agent of soft power, the one who came armed with nothing but protocol and polished shoes, remained outside, likely on the phone, recalculating, rerouting, trying to make sense of how a situation that had seemed so controllable was now slipping through her fingers. This was not how it was supposed to go. This wasn't how it ever went. The silent girl in the corner wasn't supposed to speak back. She wasn't supposed to stay. She wasn't supposed to win. And yet she had stayed, not with a speech or a dramatic gesture. She had stayed with something far more difficult. Grace under pressure, presence without aggression, a refusal to make herself smaller to fit into someone else's fragile vision of superiority. Linda stood, finally, rising in one jerky movement like a puppet with frayed strings, and crossed the cafe in sharp strides, her heels louder now, more like weapons than accessories. She stopped a breath's length from Avery's table and looked down at her with a face that could no longer hold its mask. "You've made your point," she said, low but cutting, as if offering a truce with poisoned lace. "Enjoy your table. I hope it's worth the embarrassment." Avery met her eyes, and in that single glance was the full weight of everything unsaid. The decades of women like Linda who measured worth in control and appearances, the generations of quiet girls told not to make noise, not to take up space, not to speak unless spoken to. She didn't need to stand this time. She didn't need to raise her voice. "I'm not embarrassed," she said, her tone as even as breath. "But you are." Linda flinched, not visibly, not dramatically, but internally, with that subtle intake of air that betrays a wound, struck straight into pride. "You have no idea who you're talking to," she muttered, though even as she said it, the words rang hollow like an old bell with a cracked rim. "I think I do," Avery replied. "You're someone who needs people to be beneath you, because if they aren't, then you don't know who you are." The cafe had grown silent again. This time the quiet wasn't brittle or tense. It was reverent, watchful, as if the walls themselves were listening. The woman at the counter who had first greeted Linda now stood motionless, her eyes wide, her mouth just slightly open. A couple in the back corner had stopped pretending not to watch. Even the manager, who had tried so hard to remain neutral, had stepped halfway out from the kitchen, towel still in hand, like a witness to something he could no longer pretend wasn't happening. Linda opened her mouth again, but no words came. She was unraveling, not in a grand way, but in the worst possible one. Slowly, publicly, without control. "You think this is strength?" she said at last, voice shaking, but not from emotion, from fury at her own impotence. "Sitting there with your little notebook, letting everyone feel sorry for you? You think anyone here will remember your name in a week?" "I'm not here to be remembered," Avery said. "I'm here to live in peace. You came here to be seen, and now that you are, you're falling apart." The sentence landed with a softness that made it all the more devastating. Linda recoiled, not physically, but in spirit. And for the first time, her eyes showed something other than contempt. They showed confusion, almost fear, not of Avery, but of what had been reflected back at her. In that moment, it was as if she had seen herself clearly for the first time in years, stripped of the titles and illusions she had built around her like a fortress. And she didn't like what she saw. Then, with a strange, mechanical stiffness, she turned and walked toward the exit. Her steps fast but without elegance, like she needed to escape the eyes, the silence, the truth. The door swung open, the bell chimed, and just like that she was gone. No one followed, no one called after her. There was no apology, no reconciliation, only absence, and the small echo of her heels fading down the street like a retreating storm. Avery remained seated, her chest rising slowly, her breath steady, though her hands trembled slightly now beneath the table where no one could see. She didn't want applause, she didn't want recognition. What she wanted, what she had fought for in her own quiet, relentless way, was finally hers. A place to be. To exist without defense. To sit in the light without explanation. And in that moment, it was enough. The door eased itself shut behind Linda with a final, hollow click, and the soft chime of the bell faded like a closing note to a piece no one had rehearsed, but everyone had lived through. Inside the cafe, the quiet that remained was no longer tense. It was reflective. Heavy not with conflict, but with the lingering presence of something real, something witnessed. The usual sounds of spoons against porcelain and the gentle whir of machines began to return, hesitantly at first, like a room waking from a dream. No one spoke to Avery directly, not yet. There was a kind of reverence in the distance people kept, not out of fear or judgment, but because they knew she had walked through fire and returned whole. She didn't need a chorus of support. She had become her own witness, and for once that was enough. Avery sat still at her table, the sunlight slanting across her shoulder now, warmer than before, as if something inside her had aligned with the light outside. Her sketchbook lay open, the drawing half finished but no longer abandoned. She picked up her pencil and, without looking at anyone, let her hand move. It wasn't the elderly couple she drew now, or the room, or the table. It was the window, just the window, the frame, the glass, the view beyond, and in the middle of it, an open sky. There was something healing in that view, in the act of capturing it, not because it needed to be claimed, but because it simply existed. She breathed in slowly and felt, for the first time in weeks, the quiet inside her match the quiet around her. The older man who had spoken to her earlier, the one whose wife had once sat at this very table, stood up slowly and approached with a cup of water and a folded napkin. He didn't say anything as he placed them beside her. He didn't need to. She looked up, met his eyes, and gave him a small, grateful smile, one that said more than thank you. He nodded, hand resting briefly on the table, and returned to his seat. Near the window, a woman in her 60s touched the hand of the man beside her and murmured something that made him glance over at Avery, then at the empty table where Linda had sat, and finally out the window, as though the world had rearranged itself slightly in their understanding. Avery finished the last stroke of her drawing and closed her notebook with a soft sound. Not abrupt, not final, but complete. She rose from her seat, not quickly, not slowly, and gathered her things with the gentle care of someone who respected the silence she had created around her. At the counter, the barista met her with eyes that were no longer unsure but steady with quiet admiration. "It's on the house," she said, nodding toward the empty cup. "You're welcome back any time." Avery smiled, her fingers brushing the rim of the saucer, and then, with no need for ceremony, she stepped out into the late morning sun. The light had changed since she'd first arrived. It was higher now, sharper, the kind that reveals things rather than softens them. She walked slowly down the sidewalk, the sounds of the street rising up around her. Cars passing, gulls calling in the distance, the low murmur of a world continuing on. But something inside her had shifted. It wasn't triumph she carried, or victory. It was clarity. The kind that doesn't announce itself but settles into the bones. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed and a wind lifted the edge of her dress. Avery glanced toward the horizon, toward whatever might come next, and smiled. Not because she had won, but because she hadn't walked away. And that, in a life filled with moments of shrinking, of being told to move, to quiet, to fade, was its own kind of revolution. The screen fades to white. Words appear. Some people demand silence when what they fear is the sound of someone finally speaking. Respect is not reserved, it is reflected.